Hello, this is Kathleen McKee of Oleens.com, Machine Embroidery Art. Lesson 29, Before You Sew Out. In Lesson 28, we already checked our design by looking at it in a solid view. We've looked at it at a stitch view, and we've looked at it in a realistic preview. Now, before we sew out, we want to make sure that we have checked three main things: our stitch length, our density, and our registration. The stitch length, first thing I like to do, I'm going to go to image, and I'm going to modify the image by, I'm going to turn it off actually by sliding this off. That way I can see better what's going on without the interference of the image in the background. So the first thing I want to check out is the stitch length. As I've mentioned in other lessons, you don't want your stitch length to be any shorter than 1 millimeter or any longer than 10 millimeters. So let's zoom in on one of the widest areas, and that's going to be around here. And let's measure first the outline image. I'm going to get my measure tool under the Home tab, and as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, it's in millimeters. Now, some people like to work in inches, and if you click on that, you can measure in inches. But I implore you to get used to thinking in millimeters, because in the long run, if you plan to be doing any serious digitizing, it'll be easier to communicate with other digitizers and understand what they're talking about. So we're in millimeters. We've got our measure tool, and we're going to be looking down here in this lower left hand to see how long our stitch lengths are. So when we have our measure tool, the first thing, I'm going to grab one of my shorter stitches. These look kind of long. Need to even those up. Okay, I'm going to click on the one black stitch, and I'm going to drag it to the next black stitch. And if you look down that lower left hand corner, it's 1.3 millimeters, which is more than enough for your stitch to sew out correctly. Next, I'm going to go to the red fill, and I'm going to click on the start of the red fill stitch, satin stitch, and I'm going to drag it down to the end of the satin stitch. And if you look in the lower left hand corner, it's 11.9 millimeters, which is way too long for a satin stitch. So we're going to have to change that. And it's better to catch these things before you put it on the sewing machine and have a big old mess. So we're going to go to our manual punch attributes and change this satin stitch to a fill stitch. Oh, you have to select it first. That helps. I'm going to select it, and then I'm going to change it to a fill stitch. Okay, that's a lot of stitches. Let's get the measure tool again, and I'm going to drag here, and I'm going to go down to the next stitch. And if you, excuse me, I missed it. There it is. It's about 4 millimeters. That's the default. So let's look at it, and you see the step pitch. It's 4 millimeters is the default. If you want more of a little sheen on that, and you don't want to take as much time and have as many stitches, we can increase that to about 5, and you see how it lengthens the distances between the fill stitches. So that's a little checkpoint we're going to do. The next thing, we know our stitch lengths are correct. So let's check our densities next. Now, the larger the design, like say for a jacket, if this were on a big jacket back, the more density that you're usually going to need. The smaller a design is, let's look at this in realistic actual size. That's kind of a small design, and the default is 4.5 for the density, and that's just about right. I would keep it there. You can make it a little less, but let's add some undersewing to it, and we're going to put the half stitch. Now the half stitch if you look down below in your expert mode, the half stitch on, what it's showing you here is whenever you have a tight curve, it's not going to make all the stitches come down and meet in the middle. It's going to have some stitches out on the bottom. It's going to have some come, they won't go down so far, and then that way you don't have all these stitches bunching up. That will actually just cut a hole right through your material if all these stitches came down in the middle. So whenever you're using your manual punch, try to remember to click on the half stitch. So the density on the fill looks right, but let's look at the density of the black outline. Let's see if I can. The density on the black outline is 4.5, and that is going to be way too tight for this design, for as small as it is. So I'm going to, and I remember I had done this design in 2 different parts, so we're going to select, push our finger on the control key, select that, and then while they're both selected, I want you to push the right mouse button and select objects. If you don't do that, it's not going to make the changes in both places if you don't select the objects. So we're going to lower that density, and we can lower that way down, say 3.7. And you see how much looser that is? If it were that tight, as I said, the needles are much too close together. And you could give that an undersewing, but I find usually with these outlines you don't really need to have an undersewing. So I'm going to leave that off. 3.7 is fine. Now, the last thing I said you need to check is registration. In all the views that I've checked, in the solid, and in the stitch view, and in the realistic, and I've checked it, I don't see any red jutting out or anything that's not covered. But if ever you're going to make an error, make the error of putting too much pull compensation in, because no matter how much pull compensation you think you need or have, you're going to need more. So I tell you, we're going to check the black outline. I'm going to push the control key, check the other black outline, and then I'm going to right click on my mouse and push select objects, so that I know when I make these changes it's going to happen to both. And I'm going to give that pull compensation, even though the stitch length is enough. We want it to have proper registration. In other words, we want the fill to meet equally with the outline. So I'm going to give it about 2.2, well, make it 3. You can't really give it too much. And next we're going to select the red. Now that's all in one piece, so we don't have to worry about selecting the object. And we're going to give that 1, 2, yeah, about 2 looks like it's going to be enough. Sometimes when you do your pull compensation, you're going to think, oh, this doesn't look right, the letters look too fat or whatever. But it doesn't sew out like it looks. These stitches pull in, and the line is going to be much finer than it may appear in your realistic preview or stitch or solid view. So before you ever sew out, make sure you check your stitch length, your density, and your registration or pull compensation.